Hey there, I'm here with Don today, and we're doing a data science mock interview. As you may know, we're doing these mock interviews as a way for you to get a sense of what data science interviews are like, how to go about answering one from someone who's an expert at them, and just to get a bit of an inside look at the data science interview. So I'm here with Don. Don, you want to go ahead and just say a few words about yourself before we get into the interview?
Sure. So my name is Don. I have been a data scientist on the machine learning team at Doordash for almost 2 years now. And before that, I was working in management consulting, and then I transitioned going through a boot camp.
Cool. All right, cool. Well, we can go ahead and get started in the interview then. And so, are you ready to start the interview? Awesome. Cool. So, for the purpose of this interview question, we're going to be talking about Airbnb. And so, we're going to be talking about specifically the recommendation engine in Airbnb. So, when you search a listing on Airbnb, you get a list of houses or homes that you can pick from. And then there's recommendations at the top. And so what we want to do is to improve the recommendation engine for Airbnb using your data science knowledge. Specifically, what I'd like to talk about in the interview is first what success metrics we're going to pick. So what are we looking for with improving the recommendation engine? Then we're going to talk about kind of what experiments we might design. And then we'll talk about how to interpret the data we get out of it.
Okay.
Sound okay?
Yes.
Cool.
Sounds great.
Cool. So you can go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Okay. Awesome. Do you mind if I use the whiteboard?
Go for it. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So I think the most important thing when we start off a data science project is to have a set of well-defined metrics that the business cares about, that product and engineering also cares about, so that we can ensure everyone is agreed upon for the definition of success. So we'll start with metrics of success. For any company like Airbnb or a variety of other companies out there where there is a different sides of the marketplace, we want to make sure that we are thinking or being thoughtful about every side of the marketplace for every improvement or every tweak we make to the product. So I think in terms of the metrics, we can start off by looking at different sides of the marketplace. So number one, of course, are the guests. These are the people who are actually visiting the homes or renting out the homes. And then second, we have the hosts, or the people who are posting their homes online. And then thirdly, always very important to consider is the business. So for Airbnb, their business, what do they care about in terms of their business goals or bottom line? So we can get started in going into the guests. Usually for a company that has longer term vision like Airbnb, we want to think about both lagging indicators as well as leading indicators. So leading indicators are something that you can look at yesterday, how did I do on this metric? Whereas lagging indicators are more taking a longer term perspective view of how is the health of your business doing. So for guests, a leading indicator can be, very standard sort of if you think of like a conversion funnel. So ideally, if we have a improved recommendations algorithm, whenever a guest searches for a listing on Airbnb, then the conversion funnel should improve somehow. So we can think of that in terms of whether or not after they search, whether or not they click on the listing, and then from the click to probably a sort of like what do you call it? They ask for permission, or they
request.
Request. Request the booking, and then finally, do they actually convert? Right. So do they actually purchase that booking and go to it. So this is something you can measure on like day to day, like is this a better algorithm or not? Are we getting more engagement in terms of conversion from our users? And then second, we can think about, like longer term, what do we also want to impact in terms of a lagging indicator is any company like Airbnb would care about like user retention. So retention can be measured in a variety of different ways, but we usually one core factor of retention is the time frame in which we want to measure. So this depends on the average general like order frequency of Airbnb customers, which we're not sure about right now, but we can generally maybe make a safe assumption that maybe people book on Airbnb once every 3 months, and that's like the average. So we can look at maybe 3-month retention. And the hope is that, if we have a better recommendations algorithm, that means we're giving them better recommendations for booking, and they're so happy with those bookings that they're coming back to Airbnb more often. So that would be, definitely a success for this newly improved recommendations algorithm. So I think that is pretty comprehensive for the guest side. And then we can think about the host, because we also want to make sure that this improvement is beneficial for the host as well, or at least not harmful for them. So for the host, I think leading indicators are, we've heard that hosts tend to care about making sure their bookings are all sort of consolidated into a particular time, so that they want to sort of minimize the empty days they have in between bookings, because that can maybe be a frustration or a pain point for them. So then we can think about leading indicator as something related to the average days in between bookings that they have. And then, of course, as a lagging indicator, we also care about retention as well, because we want to make sure that our hosts, especially our good hosts, are staying on the platform. One, because it's probably safe to assume that acquiring hosts is a very costly process. So if we have lower retention, that means we're going to have to spend a lot more in terms of host acquisition. So we want to make sure that this is doing well. We can probably think about retention of hosts in a similar fashion. For now, we can look at 3-month retention. And this can both be in terms of 3-month between from the day of booking. And then finally, we can think about from the Airbnb perspective. So from a business perspective, what does Airbnb care about? So obviously it wants to create a better user experience for its guests and for its hosts, but it also cares about most likely its bottom line, so revenue and profit. We want to make sure that with this new algorithm, are we getting as much revenue as we would be with the old algorithm, or is it maybe even improved? So you can look at something like total revenue, and also potentially total profit. So there could be a situation where you have 2 options for bookings, so like A versus B, and if you show A and B to a single consumer or guest, they would purchase both, but maybe option B is better for Airbnb in terms of profit, and so that could be the superior algorithm that we would want.
Cool. And I just had, it's a great structure overall. I'm just curious, so like for example, for retention, like we picked a 3-month retention, and when would we see retention in general being something that like we are like, what might be a case where we see a good leading indicator but a bad lagging indicator? So like why are we even caring about retention at all in the first place? Like, could you give kind of an example of maybe a case where we might be poorly optimizing?
Yeah, so definitely I think there could be a case as an example where maybe this new algorithm tends to prioritize listings that have very nice pictures, right? They're like very beautiful pictures, they're like professionally taken, and so that would mean sort of these higher leading indicators, at least for the guests. They're probably more likely to click on it, and they're probably more likely to actually book it and to convert. But it could be the case that the pictures are they're like not, the actual booking is not as good as the pictures,
right.
So it's almost like an expectation setting. So in that case, the guest arrives and the booking is like lower quality than expected, and they have a bad experience and they're disappointed. So then what happens is that we see a reduction in the guest retention, and they don't come back because they were disappointed with their Airbnb booking.
Gotcha.
So that would be bad for long-term business health, but in the short term we might see like a bump.
Cool, thanks. All right, great. I love these metrics. We've kind of done a good job of defining what they might look like. Now let's give some thought to the experiment and kind of like what we might run to improve this engine.
Yes. So I think for any data science project, it's important to be able to improve upon the algorithm, but just as important is to be able to actually quantify what is the impact of your sort of like technical improvements on the business, because this is how you actually can showcase your business contributions. So A/B tests are usually, or experimentation is usually the best avenue for that. In general, we think of experimentation as sort of your standard A/B testing, and in most cases that is sufficient, but I think oftentimes when you're dealing with a marketplace like Airbnb, it can be a little bit tricky to execute a standard A/B test because of these network effects that often tend to occur. So maybe we can think about just like from a first step, if we were to design an experiment, start from there, and then maybe where any problems might arise. So from a simple experiment, we can think of, okay, we have A and B, we have our old recommendations algorithm, we have a new one, and we can do something as simple as randomize on the guest level. So, for all of our guests, or within a particular region that we want to test in, we can just have half in treatment and half in control, and they would go through different recommendations algorithm, and then we would define metrics like the minimum treatment effect that we want to detect in terms of conversion or retention. This would probably take a longer experiment duration, and we would also think about statistical power. So in order to reach 80% to statistical power with a certain minimal treatment effect size, what is the length of time that we need to run it for? So those are all sort of the standard factors that you would think about when designing an experiment. But then if we think about like on the guest level, that should be fine. The guests probably aren't really interacting with each other that much. But then if we start to think about how would this A/B test work if we were trying to measure the impact of the new recommendations algorithm on the hosts, then it starts getting a little bit problematic, because the hosts in this case are not being randomized like the guests are being randomized. So you can easily have a single host that shows up in for control and for treatment. So someone in control and someone in treatment can both see the same host, and they can both convert on the same host and go there. So in that case, if this host is in both treatment and control, it would be very difficult to measure the impact of the new algorithm on these metrics like average days in between bookings and 3-month retention, because you can't isolate the effect of the new algorithm. So that's why we have these so-called network effects, when your treatment and control groups sort of impact each other, because they're all interacting in the same marketplace. So in that case, there are a lot of different sort of more advanced statistical or even like econometrics techniques that you can use to get around these network effects. One technique that's fairly common to execute on is what's called a difference in difference experiment. So it's a fairly standard econometrics experiment where you essentially get around these network effects by having a match market test. So you would have region A, and then you would have region B, and these would be, you would try to find regions that are as similar as possible in terms of their trends with respect to these metrics that you care about or that you want to evaluate against. And then so now you have control for any geographical variations, but you also want to be able to control for time or seasonal variations. So that's where the difference in difference comes from. So ideally, the main assumption is that you have these two regions and they work in essentially parallel trends. So we can take one example like guest conversion, and what would happen is we assume before we launch the experiment, region A maybe looks like this over time, and region B maybe looks like this over time. So their trends are in parallel with each other. So then what happens is region A is control, we launch the treatment at time t, and then we can use the control to assume what the treatment would have been like, or the counterfactual, if we had not launched this new feature. But since we have launched this new feature, what did we actually observe? Maybe it was up here. And then what happens is you can essentially take this difference between what your counterfactual would have been as your treatment effect. So that is one way that you can get around these network effects that come into place. This is definitely much easier explained in theory than it is to execute on, because it's oftentimes very hard to find regions that are exactly parallel over time, that are sort of these like exact matches to each other. But it's definitely better than, I would say, running the standard A/B test and trying to make these conclusions that are just not valid.
Awesome, cool. This is a great kind of discussion around what we need to be careful of with experimenting, and especially the network effects that are involved. Are there other aspects to kind of interpreting the data that we need to kind of think about now? So as we kind of develop our experiment and push through that, like what we might get back from it and how we might think about it. Do you have any other kind of additional thoughts on that element of the experiment?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think in real world experimentation, nothing ever really comes back the way that you fully expect it to. Mm-hmm. And there are often trade-offs that you have to think about, or ambiguous data. So I think it's important to be able to interpret data that might not say like, oh, this is a success or this was not a success, and be able to quantify those trade-offs in order to make ultimately the most informed decision that you can make. So what could happen is, like, we run this experiment, we believe it's fairly robust, we get these results back, and we could see something that would happen like maybe we have achieved this, so we have improved conversion for our guests, and it's going up. But we're also seeing perhaps that we have degraded this leading indicator for our hosts. So now these bookings are even more spread out than they used to be before. And we know that is a bad experience for the hosts. And then maybe, on the revenue side, we could see that we might even be like losing a little bit of revenue, maybe we tend to be showing a little bit more lower price point of bookings. So now we have to think about, should we launch this new algorithm or should we not, right? We have some successes, we also have some risks that we have to consider. So how would we make the trade-offs? I think there's no sort of perfect answer to this, but the best thing you can do is try to use existing business relationships that have been established and try and convert all of these metrics to a single common currency, such as it could be like in dollar terms, right? It could be revenue. So we can think about, what does an increase in conversion mean for longer term revenue. We can think about maybe forecasting to 6 months or even a year out. And then we can also try and convert this degradation in the host metric. What does that mean maybe on a cost side, right? So we could probably see also lower retention, or we might have to spend more money to retain those hosts. So that would be a cost. And then this revenue would also be able to, sort of in the same currency. And then we would be able to hopefully forecast out over the long term, are we actually, is this going to be a net positive or a net negative for the company?
Gotcha. Cool. This is great. And it sort of gives me a good sense of how you might think about that. One last follow-up question I have, and I know we're running a little low on time, is we certainly can convert to revenue and we get a sense of how that impacts our bottom line. But what if we care about user experience? Like, how would we account for that? Or, how would we convert to a currency that maybe it matches with user experience? Or if we can't, how do we at least get a sense of, maybe our revenue is increasing, but our user experience is declining?
Okay. So, yes, user experience, I think, is one of the most important metrics, especially for a growth company. Mm-hmm. So I would try and think about conversion is usually a good indicator of user experience, but we can even think about measuring additional things like overall customer satisfaction, try to monitor that, and overall host satisfaction. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes sort of a business decision of, are we willing to take maybe like a hit to short-term revenue in order to see this growth in terms of our user experience or engagement? And I think that becomes a business decision of what you really want to prioritize at this stage in the company.
Gotcha. Cool. All right, well, you can sit down. We can end the interview now. So that was a great job overall, by the way. And so now we'll just take some time to do some feedback and talk about how that went, and then we can kind of close it off. Cool. Overall, that was an excellent job. One of the things that I loved most about the interview is how structured it was and how clear it was. And so, whether it was whiteboarding or gesturing, you kind of walked me as the interview through how you were thinking about stuff. And it was really helpful to actually already have these things written on the board, because then you would augment them or write more stuff on them later. Someone naively might have thought that this is not a whiteboardable question, or this is like a really simple question that you don't need to whiteboard for. So I think encouraging whiteboarding is always really awesome. One thing that I thought you also did a really good job of was discussing like control versus treatment and network effects. Like, there was a very in-depth discussion around something that was an important trade-off or an important edge case for the experiment. And so thinking ahead of that and mentioning these edge cases was awesome. One thing that I think you could have done even more of was check in with me as an interviewer too. And I know we're doing kind of a mock interview, but checking in with me and just saying, like, does this sound okay? Or like, is this in the right direction? Just to get more of a pulse with the interviewer and make sure that y'all are aligned on where you're going. Mm-hmm. I also thought the discussion around trade-offs was really good, and kind of even at the end mentioning the different trade-offs and mentioning like the business decision versus data decisions and sort of distinguishing those two, which kind of speaks to the fact that you know how to work with other different individuals in an organization. And then I also really loved, like, it was very clear without jargon. Like, you were able to kind of go through the process very clearly and explain what was in your head to the whiteboard, to me, without having to go through, like, a ton of steps of, oh, this is what I'm thinking about, or, and part of the problem of an interview is figuring out how to take what's in here and, like, give it to me effectively as an interviewer effectively. So I thought you did a great job overall. Yeah. So, any other reactions or thoughts about the interview before we wrap up?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said in terms of checking in with the interviewer more.
Yeah.
I think based on my experience, that definitely is something, a feedback I would give to myself or to any other candidate. It's so important to, along the way, I would say, like, don't talk for more than, 3 minutes consecutively without checking in with your interviewer to say, like, if you're on the right track. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, even, like, body language cues are helpful too, kind of just pausing. And you did it a couple times where you just paused and gave me an opportunity to jump in too. And so I think there's, like, kind of passive and active ways to check in with the interviewer. But yeah, I mean, gosh, this interview was really great just from a structural perspective. The leading, lagging, kind of really making it clear. And I think that was helpful for me, not having to need to jump in because there was not as much confusion or lack of clarity because we were both on very similar pages. Cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and doing this, and thank you all for watching.
Cool. Thank you, guys.